Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about Islamic political thought. I'm trying to give you a foundation for an Islamic worldview and how power and authority are structured. So in English, a lot of times the term power and authority are used synonymously, okay, but they're not the same thing, right? So can anyone give me an idea of what does power mean versus what does authority mean? Give me an example of something that would be power but it wouldn't have authority, or someone who has authority but doesn't have power. Yeah.
A judge has authority.
Okay, a judge has authority but doesn't have the power to execute that, right? So it's possible for people to just reject what that guy has to say. Yeah.
They have power but they don't have authority.
Good, excellent, yeah.
NGOs, they have power but they don't have authority.
Okay, all right. So in different types of power. Power can be coercive, forcing you to do something. Power can be money, enticing you to do something. And you can have authority but no power as well, right? So that's something that's important in terms of thinking about Islamic political thought as well. Where does authority come from? So who has the right to rule? All right? And then is it just because you have power that you have legitimate authority, right? So the good example we could say in Latin America would be Venezuela, for instance, right? So the guy is in power. What's his name? Maduro, right? He's in power, but his authority is not recognized by the international community, right? So you see the difference between the two, right? So just because you have power doesn't mean you have authority, and you could have authority but have actually no power in reality, okay? Yeah.
He has authority inside the country.
Yeah, so he has authority. He claims authority within a certain, so within the country among certain people, right? So there are also people in the country who don't even acknowledge his authority as well, right? So maybe the military would agree with his authority, and that's part of how he's able to keep in power. But maybe half the population, or even more, doesn't even acknowledge his authority, but they don't have the power to do anything, right? Make sense? Yeah. Okay. All right. So just a little video, just like. Oh, sorry.
Islam is the second largest religion in the world with over 1.5 billion followers. And like Christianity, Islam is a transnational religion, meaning that there are Muslims living in every country in the world, and there are many countries that are majority Muslim. Most Muslims will think of themselves as either Shia or Sunni, but there is tremendous diversity even within Shia Islam and within Sunni Islam that's often regionally dependent. Islam literally means submission, and so Muslims see themselves as coming to God with great humility. And for Muslims, submitting to God creates a radical sense of equality. The most sacred text for Muslims is the Holy Quran, which most Muslims believe is the direct word of God, as revealed to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. And even though Muslims hold Christian and Jewish prophetic lineages as authoritative, for Muslims, the most important prophet and the final prophet is Muhammad. Muhammad brought Judeo-Christian monotheism to the Arab people about 1,300 years ago. One of the most misunderstood concepts in Islam is that of jihad, which many people interpret as a holy war. But there is nothing holy about war. And what jihad actually represents is an internal struggle, the battle that's raging in our own heart. And all of our religious traditions talk about that internal struggle. In that respect, jihad isn't just a Muslim idea, but it's a reality of the human condition. In order to understand what animates Muslim life, it's helpful to think about the 5 pillars of Islam, which is an aspiration that most Muslims around the world have. The first pillar is Shahada, or the recitation of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. The second pillar is Salat, or ritual prayer 5 times a day facing in the direction of Mecca, the holiest of Muslim sites. The third pillar is Zakat, or charitable giving to the poor. A certain percentage of your salary every year would be given for philanthropy. The fourth pillar is Ramadan, or fasting during the holy month. That month changes each year. It's based on a lunar calendar, but Muslims will generally fast for a full month. For Muslims, developing a type of self-discipline through fasting will help ensure that they are able to follow the other tenets of their faith in a way that is equally rigorous and devotional. And the fifth pillar is Hajj, or the aspiration to undertake a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your life. And through these 5 pillars, we see a global sense of community amongst Muslims, a shared sense of experience that really connects Muslims across time and space.
All right. So Islam, of course, the modern sort of understanding of Islam is based on the prophethood of Muhammad, right? So who is Muhammad? He was born in 570, died in 632 in Arabia, in a city called Mecca, which is now the holiest site for Muslims around the world. And Muhammad is kind of unique in terms of his role in the history of the world, right? Because he wasn't just a religious leader. So in many ways, for instance, Jesus, the Buddha, they were primarily religious leaders, right? That was their primary function. But Muhammad wasn't just a religious leader. He was also a political leader, a military leader. He was a legal sort of, he was a judge as well, right? So he had many different sort of hats, right? And Muhammad's founding of the tradition of Islam coincided also with the establishment of the first Muslim community in a city that's now called Medina. All right, so within Islamic political thought then, there's a tremendous amount of work that's been done and a lot of ideas related to the development of sort of political authority, right? So in the Islamic tradition historically, faith and sort of politics have been intertwined with each other. The idea of the separation is something that has come about in the modern period. In the past, to be a ruler in the Muslim world meant that you were generally Muslim if it was a Muslim kingdom, and then there would be some sort of lineage, especially for the caliphs, back to the line of Muhammad, right? So someone who would be a caliph, for instance, in the Islamic world would be someone who had a lineage that goes back to Muhammad, right? A descendant of Muhammad. So the question becomes, after Muhammad dies, who should succeed him? So if he's a prophet, he has a direct connection to God, all prophecy ends with Muhammad, so Muhammad is the last prophet. What do you do after he dies? How do you continue moving on? Who rules you? How do you find religious authority, right? So there's a big division that takes place in the world of Islam between the Sunnis and the Shia. So the Shia end up becoming the minority, the Sunni are the majority. The Sunni believed that the community of Muhammad had the final say. So the elder men of the community could decide who should lead the community. The Shias believe that that was not accurate, that there's something unique about the genealogy and the descendants of the Prophet, and that those who were closest to the Prophet, his family, knew the most about the faith and had a special connection to God. So it should be people who are the descendants of Muhammad, right? And this is kind of the major distinction that takes place theologically that has political ramifications as well in terms of the wars that end up taking place after the death of Muhammad for the succession of the community, right? And so then the question also becomes, what type of government should they have? What would be a just government, right? So one of the things that's important for Muslims is the idea of holy law. So Islam has a very similar sort of structure to Judaism, for instance, in which the law is important. So in Christianity, what's really important is belief. Do you believe in Jesus? Are you going to be saved? That's a really important thing. In Islam and Judaism, belief is not so important. It's kind of assumed, okay, you do believe. The question is, what do you do on a daily basis? Do you observe the law? Do you pray? Do you fast? Do you eat right foods? Do you avoid certain things? So the law is critical to salvation in the Islamic tradition, right? Whereas in Christianity, it's mostly belief, right? So belief versus law. These are two very different ways of thinking about religion, right? So Muslims and Jews believe that the law is important. Christians believe that Jesus fulfilled the law, and simply believing in Jesus is sufficient for salvation, right? So in the Quran, you have the end. So there's an understanding that the end of human society is the worship of God. Ultimately, what is the reason that we're here on earth? The whole point of us being on earth is to worship God. So of course, then government needs to support that. So government then should help you to better serve God, right? It's not indifferent. So when we look at the United States, the government is indifferent. It doesn't care what you believe in, right? It doesn't care if you believe in God, you don't believe in God, whatever you do, as long as you're not hurting other people, the government doesn't care about you. In a traditional Islamic society, the government does care. It cares about your salvation, and it makes sure that the society is conducive towards moral virtue and tries to minimize vice, right? So virtue and vice are very important. What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be a bad person? These are good and evil are real issues in a Muslim society. Okay, so let me see if I can show the video.
Sunnis and Shia both practice Islam, but what's the difference? A disagreement 1,400 years ago over one simple question. Who would lead the Muslim community following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD? Some believed that the Prophet Muhammad's cousin Ali was the rightful immediate heir, while others thought Abu Bakr, one of his oldest friends, was the better choice. Today, they share a lot of similar beliefs and practices, but Shia believe religious leadership must come from the Prophet Muhammad's descendants, while Sunnis don't. Of the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, about 87 to 90% are Sunni and 10 to 13% are Shia.
All right, we talked about sort of the difference. So after the death of the Prophet, there ended up being 4 what they're called rightly guided caliphs, right? The first was Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Uthman, and then Ali. Now, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman were simply companions of the Prophet. Ali was the nephew of the Prophet. So the Shias believe that Ali should have been the rightful leader, and the Sunnis believe that the way that it went was fine, right? And so what ends up happening is that the Shia then are the partisans of Ali, right? And I don't, yeah, okay. So one of the important parts of sort of the entire sort of the political theory behind Shia Islam especially is the Battle of Karbala, right? So there's a lot of tension that is building up between the Sunnis and the Shias, and the tension eventually emerges and ends in a very, very bloody conflict. And this conflict is based on Hussein. So Hussein is a grandson of the Prophet. And there's still the people that followed Ali, who was assassinated, believe that Hussein, grandson of the Prophet, should lead the community. So he takes his family and about 50 other supporters and marches on the caliph in Damascus. So now, by this time, 60 years later after the death of the Prophet, the seat of government has moved from Medina, which was where the Prophet set up the first community, to Damascus, which is in Syria, okay? And so Hussein doesn't like the way that government is being run. He feels like that Muawiyah, who is the caliph, is very corrupt. So what he's doing is now Muslims have moved out of Arabia, and now we're in control of parts of Egypt, of the Levant, some of the richest areas in the world. So he is giving governorships to his friends. He is giving wealth to his friends and not to everyone else. The way that he's making rules are benefiting his friends and not other people, right? So he believes that he's kind of left Islam as an ideal for justice and is benefiting his people and is a very corrupt leader. So Hussein and his community go, and they're going to Damascus to protest and to say, look, what you're doing is wrong. I'm the grandson of the Prophet, and you need to be held to a higher moral standard. So the community then is on their way, and they stop in Iraq, okay? So this is kind of a map of it. So Mecca is right here, Medina is right here, and then they start on the journey. Now where that other image is on top in Iraq, near the Euphrates River, the small community, about 72 people, are surrounded by an army of about 1,000 people. And they say, look, you have to surrender or we're not going to let you move forward. And they said, look, we're not going to surrender. And there were women, there were children in the camp. And the army killed everybody. It was a massacre. Okay? Only, I think, 3 or 4 women were left alive, and they were taken in shackles to Damascus. Children were killed. I mean, it was a very bloody massacre. And so this battle, then, for the Shia, is not just an ordinary battle, right? It's a battle that is emblematic of the battle between good and evil, right? So in the same way, when Jesus was killed on the cross, many other people were killed as well, right? So from the perspective of Romans, Jesus was just another person who died, right? For Christians, it was much more than someone dying. It was someone who knew he was going to die, allowed himself to be killed to redeem humanity, right? So in the Shia, it's very similar then in terms of Hussein. Hussein knows he's going to die, but he intends to go and fight against sort of those who would oppress others as a show of good versus evil. He knows he's going to die, but he knows that his descendants for the next 1,000 years are always going to remember him and use him as a symbol to push for justice. So for Shia, the Battle of Karbala then is this monumental moment in history where good tries to destroy evil, but ultimately good prevails. Even though everyone dies, it keeps the movement alive, right? Does that make sense? So you see a difference between Sunni political thought, which is majoritarian. Whatever everyone does is whatever the majority consensus is, that's fine. Whereas the Shia have a different sort of way of thinking about political justice. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So this is an image of the Passion of Karbala. So this is Hussein on his horse. This is around 19th century or so. And you can see sort of, it's a very epic story. And so the story is then told year after year. So the Shias all over the world then recount the story. They remember the story of Hussein, the people that were killed. And this, they mourn, they cry over the tragedy. And then that helps to rebuild their faith and to keep them pushing for the idea of social justice. That's something that's important for them. All right? And there's a lot of sort of details about this. Initially, one of the things that happens is that, as we said before, you have this nephew of the Prophet Ali, right? Who Shia believe should have been the caliph. Now, there's a battle that takes place, and Ali decides to declare a ceasefire and to negotiate a treaty with the people that are fighting against him. And there's a group of them, of Ali's encampment, of Ali's army, that says what you're doing is unjust. They're called the Khawarij, the Kharijites, all right? And they're kind of, in a way, sort of a more extreme function within the Muslim world, right? An extreme idea that you can only push for absolute justice and any compromise is unacceptable, right? And so when we think about even modern day terrorism, a certain element of Islamic thought comes even from the beginning of Islam, right? But again, it's a very small minority within the larger world of Islam. So when you think about sort of in Islamic political thought in India, for instance, this is a good quote. The world has been created as a battlefield between good and evil, in which evil cannot be annihilated but only temporarily kept in check. The integral relation between political theory and theology should be noted. So the idea is that every individual, every king has to fight evil, right? So if you're given authority, what's critical is for you to fight evil, to help people to worship God and to fight those forces that would go against it. So what are some of the duties of a ruler? What is a ruler in the Islamic tradition supposed to do? So if you become a king in a Muslim country, what are you supposed to do historically? Okay, so you have to do the Friday sermon where Muslims gather together for prayer, right? Friday is the holy day for Muslims, right? For Jews it's Saturday, for Christians it's Sunday, right? Okay, you come together for prayers on Fridays, and you have to lead that or make sure that it's established. The two Eid festivals, and at the end of Ramadan, and then after the Hajj, giving to the poor, making of war for people who would try to fight against you and sort of overtake your country. You would have to give judgment. You would have to be a lawbearer, hearing lawsuits, protecting from foreign armies, organization of armies, capital punishment. But ultimately, one of the most important things is the idea of justice. So what someone has to do as a leader in the Islamic, as a Muslim leader, is establish justice. And the most critical idea behind all of this is the circle of justice. So what is the circle of justice? The world is a garden hedged about by sovereignty. Sovereignty is lordship preserved by law. Law is policy governed by the king. The king is a shepherd supported by the army. The army are soldiers fed by money. Money is revenue gathered by the people. The people are servants enfolded by justice. Justice is harmony, the well-being of the world. What's going on here? What does this mean?
Everyone's dependent on each other.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're all dependent on one another, right? No one can function in society if they're not helping someone else. Everyone has a role in society, right? Everyone can't be the king. Everyone can't be the soldier. Everything is dependent on each other. Yeah.
It also, I guess, summarizes just that we all have our obligation. It's not whether we want it or not. It is our necessity to ensure we survive.
Absolutely, right? You can only survive together, right? As a society, as a community. What about the last one? Justice is harmony, the well-being of the world. Justice is harmony, the well-being of the world. Please.
If you do something bad, you're directly hurting yourself.
Absolutely, you're hurting yourself and you're hurting society as a whole, right? So what happens when there's great injustice in a society?
Evil's prevailing.
Okay, evil prevails. What else happens when there's a lot of injustice? What's happening in a place like Venezuela? Is there injustice in Venezuela? Okay, what's happening to society?
Starving.
It breaks down. It totally breaks down. The entire society just falls apart. If there's no justice, society falls apart. So that's why it's so important for a king to have laws, for people to work, so that you can have a functioning society. If the society ultimately becomes unjust, it falls apart completely. Does that make sense? And again, Islamic political thought, Chinese political thought, Indian political thought, African political thought, the focus ultimately is the community. It's the well-being of the community. One individual cannot have so much power, cannot be unjust at the detriment of the society as a whole, right? The community, the preservation of the community is central, right, to the preservation of life.